The Galactic Zoological Society, an organization known for exploring the farthest reaches of the universe, had a mission like no other. Their latest assignment was to investigate a planet marked in ancient records as Terra, a world surrounded by mystery. Long ago, the planet was thought to be abandoned after a disastrous war wiped out most life forms. The planet's signals had long since gone silent, and the records, hidden in the oldest of galactic archives, had forgotten it. But recently, strange signals, too faint to identify, had begun to emanate from Terra. The galactic zoologists, always on the hunt for new life, were intrigued. What could this signal mean? Why would a dead planet suddenly come to life? As their ship entered the atmosphere of the planet, the team marveled at the view before them. They had expected a barren wasteland, but instead, they saw forests, vast oceans, and mountains. At first, they couldn't believe it. From the edge of space, Earth, as they later learned Terra was called, looked like a beautiful, thriving world. It was nothing like the dry, barren planets they had expected. The planet was alive, and something within it seemed to be stirring. They sat down in a dense, green jungle, far away from human settlements, eager to discover what had been hidden from galactic knowledge for centuries. The team's leader, Zarnal, a being from a species known for its sharp intellect and unyielding curiosity, was the first to step out of their ship. The air was thick, filled with unfamiliar scents, and the ground beneath their feet was soft, covered in moss and strange, twisting vines. The team of zoologists followed him, their equipment in hand, scanning the environment with their advanced tech. They expected to find clues, but nothing prepared them for what they were about to experience. At first, it seemed like the forest was quiet, but it didn't take long before they started hearing strange sounds. Birds, large and small, were calling to each other in the trees, but their calls were unlike anything the team had ever heard. Some calls were sharp, aggressive. Others were almost musical, as if the creatures were communicating. A loud rustling came from a nearby bush, followed by the sight of a massive creature sprinting across the forest floor. It was unlike anything Zarnal had ever seen. A large feline with rippling muscles and eyes that glowed in the dim light of the jungle. Zarnal quickly ordered the team to stay alert. There was something about the way the creature moved that made him uneasy. It wasn't just a predator. It was hunting with purpose, with intelligence. The zoologists had studied countless species from across the galaxy, but nothing compared to the creatures of Earth. They were far more advanced than they had anticipated. Even the plants seemed to have a strange, almost conscious, interaction with the team, as if they were aware of the aliens' presence. The trees swayed, their branches reaching towards them, as though testing the strength of their resolve. The team ventured deeper into the jungle, collecting samples and taking notes, when one of the younger zoologists, Lyra, called out. She had spotted something strange. A large, serpent-like creature coiled around the trunk of a tree. At first, it seemed like a simple reptile, but upon closer inspection, it became clear that this was no ordinary animal. The creature had massive fangs, and its body seemed to shimmer with scales that changed color. Lyra cautiously approached it, studying the creature with a mix of awe and fear. But just as she was about to take a sample, the creature struck with lightning speed, its tongue darting out to taste the air. Zarnal reacted instantly, pulling Lyra back, but the creature didn't stop. It slithered faster than any predator they had seen before, moving with the precision of a hunter. The team scrambled to defend themselves. Their weapons, designed to stun or immobilize, barely fazed the creature. It seemed to be perfectly adapted to its environment, every instinct honed for survival. The team quickly realized that these creatures were not just surviving. They were thriving in ways that defied their understanding of biology. Earth's wildlife was far more dangerous than they could have imagined. As the team regrouped, Zarnal ordered a retreat. They had to reassess the situation. The creatures on Earth were far more aggressive, intelligent, and capable than anything they had encountered before. It wasn't just about studying the wildlife anymore. They had to learn how to survive on this planet, or it wouldn't make it out alive. While Zarnal and the team made their way back to their ship, something strange began to happen. The creatures that had seemed solitary at first were now appearing in greater numbers. Birds with sharp beaks and claws watched from the trees, while pack animals, like wolves, began to circle in the distance. Even the small, seemingly harmless insects seemed to be growing in size, their movements becoming more deliberate. The team noticed an odd pattern. The animals didn't seem scared of them. Instead, they were watching, analyzing, and preparing. Back at the ship, Zarnal examined the data they had collected so far. The animals of Earth were more than just wildlife. They were like living weapons. The team had just begun to scratch the surface of this discovery. There was an ancient energy here, something that had been hidden deep within Earth's ecosystem. The creatures were not merely products of evolution. They were crafted with purpose. Zarnal's mind raced as he pieced together the clues. Something ancient had shaped Earth's animals, something powerful and dangerous. But what? Who had created them, and why? Suddenly, a sharp alarm blared. The ship's sensors were picking up something massive, moving toward them at incredible speed. Zarnal's heart raced. He ordered the team into full defensive mode, but as they scrambled to prepare for what was coming, Zarnal couldn't shake the feeling that they had made a terrible mistake by coming here. Earth was not just a forgotten planet. It was a warning. As the ground shook beneath their feet and the sounds of rushing creatures filled the air, Zarnal realized that they were no longer the observers. They were the prey. The mission was no longer about discovery. It was about survival. And as the creatures of Earth closed in, Zarnal understood one thing clearly. This planet, with all its wild, deadly creatures, was not a place they could tame or study. Earth was a living weapon, and they had just awakened it. The day after their unsettling discovery, Zarnal and the team sat in their ship, staring at the data they had collected. The strange behavior of Earth's wildlife was more than just instinctive. It seemed almost planned, coordinated. The creatures didn't just live. They thrived in a way that suggested a higher purpose. Every animal they encountered had an edge to it, a deadly precision that left the zoologists unnerved. The team had barely begun to understand Earth's creatures, but one thing was clear: they were not meant to be taken lightly. Yet curiosity continued to drive them forward. They were explorers, after all, and this was an unprecedented discovery. But even the best explorers made mistakes, and this one would be a mistake they'd never forget. Zarnal couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The wildlife was too perfect, too deadly, and there was an intelligence in their movements that wasn't typical of Earth's creatures. The Velfar, the ancient race that had left behind these bizarre structures and scattered clues, had clearly known something about this planet that the rest of the galaxy did not. But that didn't stop Zarnal's curiosity. If these creatures were truly weapons, it was his job to understand them. He couldn't leave without unlocking their secrets. Despite the danger, the team pushed forward, heading deeper into the jungle. Their goal now was to capture a specimen, something they could study in detail. They had already been able to observe several creatures in their natural habitats, but getting a live sample was the only way they could truly understand what they were dealing with. After much debate, they decided on a smaller target, a wolverine-like creature that had been watching them from the edge of the clearing. Its eyes, sharp and calculating, had been following them for hours. It seemed the perfect candidate. Lyra, the youngest of the team, was the most eager. She had been pushing for the team to get more involved in the study of Earth's creatures. "We can't leave without understanding them," she argued. "If we can control one of these creatures, we'll have answers." Zarnal had hesitated, but her passion had won him over. They knew Earth's wildlife was dangerous, but the idea of studying these creatures in a controlled environment was too tempting to ignore. The team set up a trap. They used a combination of tranquilizers, containment fields, and bait to lure the creature into a cage that they had designed for containment. It wasn't foolproof, but they had been working with similar technology for centuries. The trap was set, and now they just had to wait. Time seemed to stretch as they sat, watching the clearing, the anticipation building. When the wolverine appeared, it didn't hesitate. It moved with a quiet precision, almost as though it had known exactly what was happening. Its fur shimmered in the moonlight, and its powerful muscles rippled beneath its sleek form. The moment it stepped into the trap, sudden burst of speed and power, the creature lunged. The containment field flickered, and the trap failed. The creature was free. In that instant, everything went wrong. The wolverine shot toward the team, its claws extended, and its eyes locked onto Zarnal. He barely had time to react as the creature knocked him to the ground. Its claws raking across his suit, the team scrambled, firing stun guns, but the creature dodged every shot with terrifying agility. It wasn't just attacking, it was strategizing, anticipating their moves. It was using its environment, darting into the shadows, running along the trees, and even outsmarting the alien technology meant to contain it. It was clear now that they had underestimated the creature. Earth's wildlife was not to be taken lightly. Zarnal, shaken but determined, ordered a retreat. "Fall back to the ship," he shouted, struggling to push himself to his feet. The team regrouped and made their way toward the ship. But the creature wasn't done. It had its sights set on them, and it was closing in fast. Zarnal barely had time to signal the ship to lift off as the wolverine charged toward them. The moment they boarded, the ship's thrusters engaged, and they took off into the sky, narrowly avoiding the creature's lethal claws. As they watched from the safety of their ship, the wolverine stood at the edge of the jungle, its eyes burning with intelligence. It didn't attack anymore. It just watched them, waiting. The team was quiet as they processed what had just happened. They had made a mistake. A big one. In their pursuit of knowledge, they had overestimated their ability to control these creatures. Earth's wildlife wasn't just a scientific mystery. It was an ancient power, honed by evolution, shaped into living weapons by something far older than they could comprehend. Back inside the ship, Zarnal sat with the team, reviewing the data. They had learned something crucial. These creatures were not simply living beings. They were weapons. The wolverine had known how to attack, how to escape, how to survive. It wasn't instinct alone. There was an intelligence in their actions. They were a part of a much larger system, one that seemed to be designed for survival. The Velfar, the ancient race that had vanished, had left behind a warning, but Zarnal had ignored it. He had thought the creatures of Earth were nothing more than an interesting study, something to be cataloged and analyzed. But now he knew better. They were a force of nature. The team was shaken, but there was no turning back. Zarnal's curiosity was still there, but now it was tempered by fear. They had woken something on Earth, and they didn't understand it. The wolverine was just the beginning. What other creatures had been shaped by the same ancient force? What dangers were hidden in the jungles, oceans, and skies? The zoologists had come to Earth to study life, but they had found something far more dangerous than they could have imagined. The planet was alive, alive with deadly weapons, waiting to be unleashed. Zarnal stared out of the ship's window, deep in thought. His mind raced with possibilities. The Velfar had known the power of Earth's wildlife, and now he did too. But what could they do about it? The creatures were already aware of them, and they would not stop. They had made their first mistake, and now Earth was watching. The discovery of Earth's wildlife had already shattered the preconceived notions the zoologists held about the planet. But as Zarnal and his team began digging deeper into the alien relics they had uncovered, something far more unsettling emerged, something beyond the animals, beyond Earth's ecosystems. They'd found a code, a hidden sequence, buried deep in the genetic fabric of Earth's creatures, seemed to speak of an ancient program, a blueprint not just for survival, but for the future of the entire planet. This wasn't just an evolution of life. It was the awakening code, a code designed to bring something far more significant to life. But the team had no idea what they were about to unleash. Zarnal had always trusted science, had always believed in the calm, calculated nature of his studies. But the moment the code began to decode itself, something inside him shifted. It wasn't a sudden change. It was gradual, creeping into his mind like a fog. The numbers and patterns twisted and turned on the screen, and as they began to translate, they revealed something that made Zarnal's blood run cold. The code was not just biological. It was an intelligence. It spoke in patterns, like a language only a few could comprehend. And as they studied it, Zarnal realized something terrible. This was not a message meant for them. It was a signal that Earth's wildlife had been waiting for. In the stillness of their lab, the team gathered around the glowing screen, their faces pale with shock. Lyra, the youngest member of the group, was the first to speak. Her voice trembled, barely above a whisper. It's calling them, she said, the weight of her words settling heavily in the room. The screen displayed complex symbols, sequences that looked like a message encoded in the very DNA of Earth's creatures. Zarnal, once confident and fearless, now felt a knot twist in his stomach. The creatures, all of them, weren't simply existing. They were waiting for something. They were programmed, it seemed, for a moment like this, a moment when the awakening code would trigger a change, a shift that would alter the course of history. As the team continued to investigate, they realized the true scale of what they were dealing with. The code wasn't just biological. It was a communication system. Every animal, every organism on Earth had been tuned to respond to it. The very patterns of nature, the cycles of the seasons, were all linked to the awakening of something far more significant. Zarnal felt a chill crawl up his spine as he came to the terrifying realization that Earth wasn't just a planet. It was a weapon designed to awaken, to evolve, and to prepare for a purpose that had yet to be revealed. The question now was, what was it preparing for? The team was divided. Some wanted to stop the decoding, to seal the relics and bury them before they could learn more. They had seen enough of Earth's creatures to understand how dangerous they could be. Others, like Lyra, were drawn to the mystery, hungry for answers. But Zarnal, despite the rising dread in his chest, knew they couldn't stop. The awakening code was already in motion, and it wasn't something they could undo. Whatever was coming, whatever had been set into motion, they had to understand it. The days that followed were filled with tension. Every move they made seemed to ripple through the world around them. Animals grew restless. Birds flew in strange patterns, never returning to their nests. Large predators moved in unpredictable ways, no longer confined to the boundaries of their territories. Zarnal couldn't help but feel that they had crossed a line. He wasn't sure if it was too late to turn back, but there was no denying the unsettling truth. Something was changing on Earth, and it was bigger than any of them had anticipated. One evening, as the team sat around a table, reviewing the final pieces of the code, they received a transmission. It was a garbled signal at first, almost as if it were struggling to break through static. But then, as the transmission cleared, they saw it, a live feed from one of the monitoring drones they had sent out earlier. The camera was zoomed in on a field just outside their location, and the animals that appeared on the screen were unlike anything they had seen before. It was as if the creatures had undergone a transformation, their movements sharper, more coordinated. They seemed to be assembling, gathering in groups as if answering a call. "Get the drone closer," Zarnal ordered, his voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. He couldn't explain the feeling he had, the overwhelming sense that this was the moment everything would change. The drone advanced, and as it did, the animals began to converge on a single point. The transmission blurred for a moment, and then, in an instant, the scene became clearer than ever before. The animals weren't just gathering. They were forming something, a structure, or perhaps a formation, that seemed to pulse with energy. The awakening code had done its job. The animals had answered the call. And now, they were working together, as if guided by a force far beyond their natural instincts. Zarnal watched in awe, but a part of him was terrified. This wasn't just a natural phenomenon. This was something deliberate. The creatures weren't acting on instinct alone. They were responding to something greater. They were awakening, evolving into something new. But what were they becoming? As the night drew on, the team's unease grew. They couldn't explain it, but the air around them felt charged, as if the very atmosphere was thick with expectation. The animals were no longer behaving in ways they could predict. They were moving with a purpose. And as Zarnal stood in front of the window, gazing at the now eerily quiet landscape, he realized that this was no accident. The code was awakening a power, and whatever it was too late to stop. By the following morning, the landscape had changed. The creatures that once roamed freely had now formed intricate patterns, marching in coordinated groups across the land. They were no longer scattered. They were united by the code. Zarnal stood at the helm of the ship, his heart racing as he watched the world outside shift in front of his eyes. The planet wasn't the same anymore. Earth had begun to change, and the awakening code had set the stage for something far more significant. It was as if the Earth itself was waking up. But what had they awakened? And was it something they could control? The questions echoed through Zarnal's mind as he watched the animals, their movements now synchronized, as if the planet itself was preparing for something that only the code could explain. But as the team continued to study the transmission, they realized one thing was clear. Whatever the awakening code had triggered, it was just the beginning. Zarnal knew they had to prepare. The planet had shifted, and the creatures had started to evolve into something new, something they could not yet comprehend. There was no going back. The awakening code had done its work, and now it was time for Earth's true purpose to unfold. The team could only wait, anxiously watching the skies, the forests, and the oceans for what was to come. But deep in Zarnal's gut, he felt the cold truth. They had set in motion something far beyond their control. It was an evening like no other. The wind had picked up, carrying with it an eerie stillness, and the skies above were a dull gray, heavy with the promise of a storm. But the storm wasn't coming from the skies. It was coming from the ground itself. Deep beneath the Earth's surface, something ancient had awakened, and with it, the beginning of something far darker than any of them could have imagined. The great hunt was about to begin. For centuries, Earth had been a silent observer, a passive player in a cosmic game of survival. But that was before the arrival of the visitors, an ancient alien race that had observed Earth's creatures for eons. They had watched as humanity grew, expanded, and dominated, but they never intervened. Not until now. And when they finally decided it was time to act, the planet itself seemed to respond. Something in the Earth's core had triggered a response, one that no one saw coming. The predators had been awakened, and now they were being hunted. At the head of this hunt was a being known only as the Hunter, a towering figure standing nearly 10 feet tall. Its body was covered in sleek, metallic armor, blending seamlessly with the dark terrain of the forest. Its eyes glowed a piercing red, scanning the landscape for any sign of movement. It was an apex predator, a hunter created by the visitors to bring balance to the universe. For too long, Earth had been left alone, and the visitors had decided it was time for the creatures that called this world home to prove their worth. In the remote forests of the Pacific Northwest, a group of humans had gathered, unknowingly part of the visitors' plan. They were survivalists, each one trained to endure the harshest environments. They had no idea that they were being watched, their every move being observed by the hunter and its team. The humans thought they were participating in a reality show, testing their skills in the wilderness, unaware that the true game was about to begin. As the group set up camp, the first signs of something wrong began to appear. The animals, usually plentiful in these forests, had become silent. The wind, once a gentle companion, had stopped, leaving a stifling stillness that hung heavy in the air. Then, without warning, A low rumble echoed through the trees, followed by a series of distant crashes. It was as if something massive was moving through the forest, and the ground beneath them seemed to tremble. The leader of the group, a man named John, felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He'd been a survival expert for years, but nothing in his experience could explain the unnatural silence that had fallen over the forest. He called the group together, trying to keep them calm, but deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. His instincts screamed at him to leave, but they were too far into the wilderness, and turning back now would mean certain failure. They were stuck. The first attack came without warning. A massive creature, unlike anything the group had ever seen, burst through the trees. It was a towering beast, with sharp claws that gleamed like steel and eyes that glowed a terrifying red. It moved with lightning speed, swatting aside trees as if they were mere twigs. The humans barely had time to react before the beast was upon them. It struck without hesitation, tearing through their camp with a terrifying ferocity. John barely had time to draw his weapon before the creature was upon him. He fired, but the creature barely flinched. It was clear that their weapons were useless against it. As the group scattered, trying to find cover, the creature moved with precision, picking them off one by one. John, along with a few others, managed to make it to a nearby cave, but it was clear that they were being hunted. The creature wasn't attacking out of hunger. It was attacking for sport. The humans were nothing more than prey in a twisted game, and they were losing. Meanwhile, the hunter watched from a distance, its red eyes glowing brighter with every passing second. It had been programmed to find the strongest, most capable creatures on Earth, to push them to their limits, and to see if they were worthy of survival. The humans had no idea that they had been chosen as part of the test. To the hunter, they were simply the first part of the great hunt, and in the eyes of the visitors, this hunt had only just begun. As the hours passed, the humans began to realize the full scope of what they were facing. It wasn't just one creature. There were others, scattered throughout the forest, each one more dangerous than the last. The creatures were relentless, hunting them down with an eerie precision, their movements coordinated as if they were part of a larger strategy. The humans were being driven into a corner, with nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. John tried to rally his team, but it was clear that their hope was fading. The creatures were too fast, too strong, and too smart. Every plan they devised ended in failure. Every escape attempt was thwarted before it even began. They were being hunted, not by animals, but by something far more intelligent, something with a purpose. It wasn't until the night that the full horror of the situation became clear. The creatures had not only hunted them, they had begun to set traps. The once quiet forest had transformed into a deadly maze, with each step leading them deeper into the grasp of the predators. John knew they couldn't keep running. They had to fight back, or they would all die. The group made one final stand in the clearing near the cave, ready to face the creatures head-on. They had gathered their weapons, their tools, and their wits. But the creatures were closing in. The wind had picked up again, howling through the trees, and the sky was alive with flashes of lightning. The great hunt was reaching its climax, and the creatures were ready to strike. In that moment, John realized the truth. This wasn't just a game of survival. It was a test set by the visitors to see if humanity was worthy of surviving in a universe full of predators. The creatures were merely the first wave, and the real hunt was about to begin. Earth wasn't just a planet. It was a battleground, and the great hunt was the first step towards something far greater. With that realization, the battle began. The humans fought with everything they had, using their training, their skills, and their courage to push back against the relentless onslaught. But in the end, it was clear that the true hunters were not the creatures, but the visitors themselves. The great hunt had only just begun, and the fate of humanity hung in the balance. The air was thick with anticipation. Every living thing on Earth seemed to hold its breath, as if the planet itself had become aware of the monumental event unfolding. Above, the sky was an unnatural shade of deep red, casting an ominous glow over the desolate landscapes below. The silence was deafening, and the world had never felt so still, as if time itself was standing on the edge of a cliff. At the center of this eerie calm stood humanity, once the dominant force on Earth, now facing its most terrifying challenge. The final decision that would determine its future. Months had passed since the first attack. Since the arrival of the visitors, the world had been plunged into chaos. Cities had fallen. Governments had crumbled. What remained of humanity was scattered, divided, and broken. But amidst the destruction, something had changed. Humanity had fought back. They had risen from the ashes, united under a single purpose: survival. Now, on the verge of extinction, the final test had arrived. The visitors had come to Earth not only to observe, but to judge, and the humans had no idea whether they had passed or failed. At the heart of this judgment was the Council of Elders, a group of ancient beings from across the galaxy who had witnessed countless civilizations rise and fall. They had watched Earth from the shadows, waiting for the moment when humanity would prove whether it was worthy of survival or destined to be erased from the cosmos. For the Council, the fate of Earth had already been decided long before the first human stepped foot on its soil. They had always believed that humanity was nothing more than a fleeting spark, a temporary existence in the grand scheme of the universe. But there were a few among the Council who had begun to question this, and that is where the final decision rested. The humans, unknowingly, had become part of a grand experiment. The visitors had watched them for centuries, observing their capacity for violence, their ability to adapt, and their unyielding drive to survive. When the attacks began, the humans had fought back with a ferocity that surprised even the visitors. Cities had been lost, but they had been reclaimed. Soldiers, once overwhelmed, had found new strength in the face of impossible odds. And slowly, the visitors began to realize that humanity was not just another species to be discarded. They were different. But was it enough? John, a former soldier, now a leader of a resistance group, stood before the Council's emissary, an alien figure shrouded in a robe of shimmering energy. His heart pounded in his chest as he waited for the final judgment. He had seen the horrors that the visitors had brought. He had seen his friends die, cities burn, and entire nations fall. But through it all, humanity had fought back, and now he stood here, the weight of the world on his shoulders. The future of his species rested on his next words. The emissary's voice broke the silence. "You have fought well, human," it said, its tone cold and mechanical. "But survival alone does not grant you the right to live. Your species has shown resilience, but resilience is not enough. What have you learned from this trial? What have you learned from the suffering you have caused?" John's mind raced. He had witnessed the pain and destruction that the visitors had inflicted upon Earth. He had seen the horrors of war and the toll it took on humanity. But through it all, he had seen something else. A spark. Humanity had fought not just to survive, but to protect what was good, what was pure. They had fought for their families, for their homes, for their future. In the face of annihilation, they had shown compassion, courage, and hope. These were the things that made them different, that set them apart from the countless civilizations that had fallen before them. But could he put this into words? "We've learned that we are capable of more than just destruction," John said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "We've learned that even in the darkest of times, there is always a way to fight for something greater. We've learned that our survival isn't just about us. It's about everyone we protect, everyone we love. We've learned that we can change, we can evolve, and we can build a future, no matter the odds." The emissary was silent for a moment, its eyes scanning John, as though weighing his every word. Finally, it spoke. "And yet your species continues to destroy. You fight not only to survive, but to dominate. How can you prove that you will not repeat the mistakes of the past?" John felt the weight of the question. The war had torn Earth apart. Humanity had fought for survival, but in doing so, it had caused its own devastation. There had been acts of cruelty, of selfishness, of greed. But there had also been acts of unimaginable kindness. People had come together in ways that transcended nationalities, races, and ideologies. They had learned from their mistakes. They had rebuilt. "We're not perfect," John admitted, his voice breaking slightly. "But we are learning. Every day, we are learning to do better. We've seen the consequences of our actions, and we are working to change. We're not asking for forgiveness, but we are asking for the chance to prove that we can be more than what we were." The emissary's gaze softened, just for a moment. It was as though the being was considering John's words, weighing the possibilities. And in that moment of silence, the entire planet seemed to hold its breath. Every human on Earth was waiting for the answer. "Very well," the emissary said, its voice no longer cold but strangely warm. "Your species has shown promise. But promise alone is not enough. You will be given one final opportunity to prove yourselves. This will not be a test of strength, but of wisdom. You must choose. Will you continue down the path of destruction, or will you learn to live in harmony with your world, with each other, and with the universe? The decision is yours, human." The emissary stepped back, its form fading into the darkness, leaving John alone in the eerie quiet. The weight of the decision hung heavy in the air. It was no longer a question of survival. It was a question of evolution. Humanity had been given a choice: to repeat the mistakes of the past or to forge a new path. As John stood there, staring at the empty space where the emissary had been, he felt something stirring within him. It was no longer about fighting for survival. It was about fighting for something greater. The final decision had been made. The future of Earth and humanity was in their hands, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of hope.